There's a common complaint that studies trying to restrict carb or fat don't go low enough. And in fact, every time we cover a study on low fat or low carb, somebody will say in the comments, it wasn't low enough. It's not low carb enough. It's not low fat enough. So a brand new study tried to address exactly this question of the lower and lower ranges. We spoke with the first author, Dr. Lucia Aronica, who is a lecturer in nutrigenomics at Stanford University. Can you explain what the rationale was? Why did you guys decide to do this analysis? What was the goal? What were you guys looking for?
Yes, thank you for this question and for having me so that I can help you, your audience and the general public understand better this study and nutrition science in general. Context matters always. So this was a secondary analysis of a bigger randomized clinical trial, the largest randomized clinical trial comparing a low-fat versus a low-carb diet, called the DIETFITS study. The premise of this study is that one diet doesn't fit all. So we were comparing two diets with different macronutrient composition, but with a common feature. So both diets were cutting down on refined grains and refined carbohydrates. And we can all agree, although one diet doesn't fit all, we can all agree that this is a common feature of all healthy diets, cutting down on refined carbohydrates and sugar. So we decided, okay, this is a common feature. And then we are going to differentiate the macronutrient composition of the diets, having a low-carb diet, a healthy low-carb diet, and a healthy low-fat diet. Now, this was a very large trial involving 609 overweight or obese men and women, overall healthy, so no diabetes, although many of them had insulin resistance, of course, being overweight or obese. The overall design was starting the first 3 months with an ultra-low-fat and ketogenic-like diet. So the ultra-low-fat diet, people were encouraged to eat less than 20 grams of fat per day. And for the low-carb diet, they were encouraged for the first 3 months to eat less than 20 grams per day. But then after this very restrictive phase, people were encouraged to add carbohydrates or fat up to a level that was sustainable for forever, but still as low as possible. One criticism that we got from many people is that we never tested, the very, very low fat or very low carb diet, but this was not the goal of the study. We decided to carry out this secondary analysis in response to the criticism that we didn't test, we didn't look at the extreme groups. Being a secondary analysis means that this study has many limitations. Whereas, in a randomized clinical trials, we can eliminate or counteract some confounding factors, whereas when you go and select groups within a bigger study, you are basically turning the study into an observational study. So this is an important limitation to consider. In this analysis, we selected the people that at 3 months were following either an ultra low fat diet with less than 15% of calories from fat, or a ketogenic-like diet with the maximum 30 grams of net carbohydrates. Net carbohydrates means total carbohydrates minus those coming from fiber. Only 39 out of the 609 participants complied. There were 21 for the ultra low fat diet group and 18 for the ketogenic-like dieters. these small groups provided some interesting insights into how these diets might affect our food choices and cardiovascular health in the context of this very particular study focused on healthy diets and weight loss diets with focus on the elimination of refined carbohydrates and sugar. This is very important.
Okay, quick recap, because that was a lot of information. So DIETFITS was a large trial conducted at Stanford comparing carb restriction to fat restriction. 609 participants were split randomly between the two groups, and they were asked to cut down on carb or fat, depending on the group, to under 20 grams a day. And they did that for a couple months, and then they entered the second phase of the study, where they were asked to find a diet that they felt was sustainable long term. They were allowed to add more fat or more carb if they felt that was necessary to achieve sustainability, but still trying to stay as low as possible. The trial lasted a total of 1 year, and if you want more detail on the design or why they designed it that way, check out our interview with Professor Christopher Gardner. Now, as you might imagine, there was a lot of variability. Some people chose higher ranges of fat and carb, some people chose lower. So this new analysis that just came out that we are going over looks specifically at the subset of participants that chose the lowest ranges, lowest carb and lowest fat. And specifically, people who chose diets under 15% of calories from fat, which was roughly 26 grams a day, or under 30 grams a day of net carbohydrate. The rule of thumb for ketosis is to try to stay under 50 grams of carb a day. So under 30 is pretty strict. It puts us in the ballpark of a ketogenic-like diet. And they found that 18 people out of about 300 total in the carbohydrate restriction group chose this range. And for fat, they actually wanted to look at the 10% of calories from fat as a threshold initially, because I think some of the very low fat gurus suggest that, but there were only 5 people under that cutoff. So you can't really run an analysis like that. So they had to up the bar a bit to 15% of calories from fat. And there were 21 people that chose diets that fell under that threshold. Again, out of about 300 total that were restricting fat. So in both groups, we have about 20 people out of 300 or so. So less than 10% of the total participants fell in these stricter ranges. Now, I realize some viewers only care about the 10% cutoff, and if it's one bite over that, the analysis is worthless. It's not even worth looking at. So I talked to the authors, and they were super nice, super helpful, and they gave me access to the unpublished raw data. So we will be looking at that small group of 5 people that stayed under 10%. We'll look at the published results first using the 15% cutoff, and after that, we'll take a look at the 10% cutoff, those 5 people, the unpublished data. All right, so stick around. Okay, so what happened? Results-wise. First, did they stick to those thresholds that they chose at the 3-month mark? Remember, they chose these dietary compositions after 3 months that they felt were sustainable long-term. Then they had another 9 months of trial. By the end of the year, the 21 people restricting fat were getting about 24% of their calories from fat. And the 18 people in the carb restriction group were actually eating about 77 grams of net carbs per day. So you can see that in both groups, people felt the need to add more carb and fat to reach sustainability compared to the range they chose at 3 months. In both cases, they're still eating less than they were before the trial, so they were able to maintain a reduction, just not as extreme as they initially estimated. And we'll come back to this in the end. Let's look at the rest of the results. Caloric intake. Both groups reduced their caloric intake compared to before the trial, about 35% reduction at 3 months, no significant difference between them. And by 1 year, the fat restriction folks were eating an average of 19% less calories than before the trial, and the low carb group 26% under baseline. Seems a bit lower on low carb, although it didn't reach statistical significance between the two groups. Bear in mind, they weren't told to cut calories or to count calories or to think about calories at all, but the act of trying to restrict carbohydrate or fat, respectively, led to them eating less calories overall, and by a roughly similar margin. Interesting, right? Looking at body weight now, by 3 months, they lost about 9 kilos on the fat restriction and about 10 kilos on low carb. No significant difference between the two groups. And by 1 year, they basically kept the weight off, about 10 kilos in each group compared to before the trial. And again, no significant difference between the two. And they didn't report body composition or fat mass or lean mass in this analysis. Insulin resistance, at 3 months, both groups improved. Both groups reduced insulin resistance by 1.4 units of HOMA-IR, which represented a roughly 30% reduction in insulin resistance in both groups, with no significant difference between them. And by 1 year, they held that improvement. Percentage-wise, the improvement seemed a bit more marked in the fat restriction group, 37% lower insulin resistance versus 28% on low carb, but no significant difference between them. Bottom line, both improved insulin resistance with no clear superiority of either one. And finally, let's look at lipids. Some interesting changes here. LDL cholesterol, before the trial, it was high in both groups. Normal is under 100, and this is all milligrams per deciliter. No significant difference between them at baseline. At 3 months, no significant change on the fat restriction, while on low carb, LDL cholesterol went up about 15 points. And by 1 year, no significant difference from baseline in either group, and not different from each other. So that rise on low carb at 3 months seems to be transient in this context of this trial. And we'll come back to this in the end as well. Triglycerides, high in both groups before the trial. Normal is under 100. And again, this is all milligrams per deciliter and no significant difference between them. Not very surprising that triglycerides are high since they're very overweight. At 3 months, no change on fat restriction, but on low carb, there's a drop of over 100 points, significantly lower than baseline, although the difference between the two groups didn't reach statistical significance. And at 1 year, similar. Low carb, lower than baseline, but no significant difference between the two groups. But clear trend of improvement on low carb. And finally, HDL cholesterol, similar at baseline, no significant changes at 3 months, and by 1 year, there's an increase on low carb of about 5 points. And they didn't report ApoB or any of these metrics of lipoproteins in this analysis. I think they have another publication coming focusing on those measures. So those were the results in a nutshell. Now, there was an important caveat, specifically in the fat restriction group. So here's Dr. Aronica explaining what happened.
One surprising fact was those following an ultra low fat diet for 3 months ended up actually increasing their consumption of refined grains by over 50% by the study end. It's almost like that rebound effect. And in contrast, those following a high-fat ketogenic-like diet, although they at 3 months, although they slowly reintroduced refined carbohydrates throughout the study, at the end of the study, they had reduced their intake of refined grains by over 50% compared to baseline. Now, we don't have, this is an observation, we don't know why this happens, but a possible explanation is that people who follow an ultra-low-fat diet may compensate for the restriction in fat intake by eating more refined carbohydrates, whereas those who eat a higher fat diet, low in carbohydrates, may feel more satiated and crave fewer refined carbohydrates. So this a practical tip could be for those who follow an ultra-low-fat diet, just being mindful of their refined carbohydrate intake and track it over time.
Mm-hmm. Even though we see the similar weight loss and similar improvement in insulin resistance, the fact that they had this diet that had more refined carbohydrates suggests that we should look beyond just weight loss, because a lot of times the focus is on weight loss. I lost the weight, I don't care about the rest of the markers, but clearly there's room for improvement there in terms of getting healthier sources of carbohydrate in the case of the low-fat people.
Oh, yes, yes. And thank you for mentioning that, because again, although overweight people are probably a majority of people, especially in the US, there are people, elderly people who may not be overweight. And I have an elderly mom, she's 82, she's the love of my life. So because of this, I'm very, very, attentive also to these other groups of people. And I think, again, that is where the message, we need to focus on quality, because for those people, then beyond weight loss, there are other benefits, and focusing on quality of the diet is going to bring the best results.
So just to show you the numbers on that refined grain intake, around 100 grams a day of intake at baseline, no significant difference between the two groups. By 3 months, lower in both, especially on low carb, dramatic reduction on low carb, almost no refined grain intake. And by 1 year, both had gone up, both had rebounded a bit, but much less on low carb. The low carb group is still getting about half of the refined grains they were eating before the trial, whereas the people cutting fat were actually eating more refined grains than before the trial, and 4 times more than people on low carb. Added sugars, similar picture overall, about 50 grams a day intake before the trial, no significant difference between. 3 months, both reduced, especially low carb, and by 1 year, both rebounded and less so on low carb. Okay, before we recap everything and we look at some of the implications, I promised you we were going to look at those 5 people that stayed under 10% of calories from fat. So 5 people had chosen diets under that threshold by the 3-month mark, as we said, and none of them actually stuck to that range for the entirety of the trial. By the end, by the 1-year mark, they were eating an average of 19% of their calories from fat, and this group of 5 people lost 9.3 kilos in average over the full year, and their insulin resistance improved by 24%. So similar ballpark as we saw for the larger group, using the 15% threshold, the published data. I also took a look at their lipids, their triglycerides and LDL cholesterol. A lot of variability. Some of these individuals had big drops in triglycerides, like 100 points or more, and some had higher triglycerides after the trial than before. I ran a quick statistical test. With 5 participants, it's pretty much meaningless, but just for the heck of it. And overall, there was no significant change in triglycerides or LDL cholesterol over the course of the trial for these 5 people, which again is similar to the picture we saw for the larger group using 15% cutoff. So, a couple takeaways from this analysis. First, huge variability in dietary preference. Some people choose diets that are very low in fat or very low in carbohydrate, and some people don't. Most people seem to struggle to maintain very strict restrictions, especially long term, but some people can do it, and some people enjoy it. I know we have viewers who are on very low carb and very low fat diets for years and years, and you guys say that you like it and it helps you maintain healthy body weight and other measures, so why not? Second takeaway, a lot of different diet compositions can work for weight loss and insulin resistance improvements. I know on social media it's chaos. Every guru is yelling at you that his favorite diet is the only true path, it's the only thing that works, and every other diet is some kind of crime. But when we look at the science, we consistently see that a lot of dietary compositions can work. So the key is to find something that satiates you while keeping calories reasonable. And it doesn't have to be the same thing as the next guy. That's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Third takeaway, and probably the most important, focus on diet quality. The quality of the carbohydrates that you choose to eat, the quality of the fats that you choose to eat, not just the quantity, not just how much carb, how much fat. Really important to go easy on refined carbs, regardless of whether you're low carb or high carb or low fat or neither. Mediterranean, Nordic diet, whatever. The group eating fat ended up eating a lot more refined carbohydrates. That's not a necessity, but that's what ended up happening in this case. So it's actually not that surprising that their triglycerides didn't improve much, despite the respectable weight loss in that group, because refined carbohydrates tend to worsen triglycerides. And notice they still got the improvements in weight loss and insulin resistance, which is good, but it's not the full picture. Diet quality still matters, and it gives you additional benefits that you can't see just by looking at the bathroom scale. As for LDL cholesterol, it didn't change much over the course of the full year of the trial. There was that transient increase on low carb, but overall, not a lot of change. It is worth bearing in mind, LDL cholesterol was high to begin with in both groups. They were both hypercholesterolemic at baseline. So there's still plenty of room for improvement in both. And it's interesting that low carb has this reputation for skyrocketing cholesterol. Well, not necessarily. It can even lower cholesterol, depending how it's designed, depending on what you actually eat, right? Type of fat that you eat, how much fiber is in the diet, are there refined carbohydrates, genetics, individual variability, etc., right? Depends on context, as Dr. Aronica emphasized. So we have a lot of content on that for people who want more detail. I'll also link below in the description a video that Dr. Aronica made going over the findings of the study. So definitely check that out. For more information on keto and cholesterol, check out this video comparing keto to a Mediterranean diet. And here's that interview with Professor Christopher Gardner where we talked about the best diets for humans. Check those out. I'll see you over there.